It happened one night with my young cousin, Jake. At that time, he had just turned 18, and I was 20. It was my dad's birthday. So naturally, there was a big gathering at our house. Jake's parents came over, too, which was how he ended up at my place. I hadn't seen him in what felt like ages. And when I did, man, he had changed. He was taller, his dark hair a little longer and messier in a way that made him look effortlessly cool. He'd filled out a bit, too, muscles showing just under his shirt. I tried to play it off like I wasn't checking him out. But he caught my eye, smirked, and walked over to hug me. When we hugged, it wasn't just a quick pat on the back. It was one of those hugs where you feel someone's warmth settle in your chest. And yeah, I felt something, a little spark. It wasn't one-sided, either. I could tell he felt it too, from the way his hands lingered on my shoulders when we pulled away. We exchanged the usual small talk. How have you been? What's new? But there was this undercurrent. Something unspoken but heavy. It made my palms sweat a bit. And I couldn't help but feel this nervous excitement bubbling up. Dinner was great. The table was packed with food, conversation, and laughter. But between bites and sips, I kept sneaking glances at Jake. He'd catch me sometimes, eyes twinkling, and it was like we were sharing some secret joke. The evening went on, and after the cake was cut and people started settling into groups to chat or drink, Jake nudged me and asked if we could hang out in my room. I didn't even hesitate. Yeah, let's go, I said, trying to keep my tone casual, even though my heart was pounding. We walked up the stairs side by side, our arms brushing for a second, which felt like an electric shock. My room felt smaller with him in it, the air thicker. I flopped onto my bed, motioning for him to join, and when he did, the space between us was just enough that I could feel his presence. His fresh, slightly spicy scent. It was the kind of night that made everything feel possible, and I knew in that moment things were about to change. That night in my room, the atmosphere was thick with this unspoken tension. We'd both had a few beers during dinner, just enough to feel that warm buzz where your inhibitions loosen, but you're not completely gone. Jake was sitting on my bed next to me, leaning back on his hands, legs stretched out. He was looking at me, not in the way friends do, but with this intensity that made my chest tighten. We were talking. I don't even remember what about at first. Something random like school or music. But it didn't really matter. What mattered was how I couldn't stop admiring him. How he'd run his hand through his dark hair every few minutes. And the way his shirt hugged his frame. I was trying so hard to keep my cool. My mind was racing, every part of me hyper-aware of his proximity. I could see the small vein on his neck, how it pulsed subtly when he laughed at something I said, and I wanted to trace it with my fingers. I could smell him, that faint mix of cologne and something just him. And it was intoxicating, but I couldn't do anything. This was Jake, my friend, practically my little brother, even though we were only 2 years apart. We'd grown up together, spent countless summers playing stupid games, fighting over video games, and staying up late talking about everything and nothing. But this time, the way we were sitting felt different. The words were there, but the silences spoke louder, stretched out between us like an invitation. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the weight of all the thoughts I couldn't say out loud. I wanted to touch him, to close that space between us. But the fear of shattering what we had was enough to keep me still. My throat felt tight as I tried to focus on whatever story he was telling, nodding and laughing at the right moments. But I was distracted by the way his lips moved, imagining what it would be like to kiss him, to feel his mouth against mine. My hands fidgeted in my lap, and I was suddenly aware of the heat in the room. Jake noticed, too, I think, because he glanced at me with a knowing look, eyes softer, his gaze slipping down to my mouth for just a split second before darting back up. My heart stuttered. Did he just do that? Was I imagining it? I wasn't sure, but the possibility left me breathless. I wondered if he could tell how nervous I was, how every shift he made sent a jolt through me. So he said, leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, "Now, remember that time at the lake last summer? His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. We started reminiscing, and the conversation turned to stories about when we were younger, dumb pranks and shared adventures. But as we talked, I couldn't shake the desire building up inside me. The way he moved, the way he laughed, it all felt amplified, like every detail was magnified and pushing me closer to the edge. I kept thinking about what it would be like to close that gap, to feel his skin against mine. But I was stuck in my own head, tangled in all the what-ifs. What if he wasn't into guys? What if this ruined everything? The questions circled until my thoughts blurred, and I found myself struggling to stay in the moment. Jake leaned back again, propping himself up with one arm as he stretched his legs out, crossing them at the ankles. His other hand reached up to scratch the back of his neck, making the muscles in his arm flex slightly. It was stupid, the kind of detail no one else would notice. But it made my mouth go dry. The room felt smaller, the silence between us louder. I wanted so badly to say something, to reach out and touch him, to take that chance, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fear of messing up what we had, of getting it wrong, froze me in place. So I stayed there, watching him, wanting him, but keeping that distance because it was safer. Safer but not easier. Eventually, we both quieted down, and the weight of the night settled over us. We just sat there, listening to the faint sounds of our parents' laughter and clinking glasses downstairs. I felt my eyes getting heavy, the alcohol and tension making me drowsy. Before I knew it, I dozed off, my head leaning against the headboard, the quiet breathing of Jake beside me filling the room as I drifted into sleep. But sleep didn't last long. I don't know how long I'd been out, maybe an hour at most. But I woke up feeling disoriented, caught somewhere between sleep and waking. The room was dim, with the only light coming from the glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. At first, I didn't know what had woken me up, but then I felt it. A shift next to me, the warmth of someone close. Too close. I blinked a couple of times to clear the haze from my mind. And that's when I realized Jake was sitting up beside me. The second thing I noticed was his face, just inches from mine, so close I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. My brain tried to catch up with what was happening, still foggy from sleep and alcohol. His expression was something I hadn't seen before, a mix of hesitation and intensity. His eyes met mine for a moment, searching, like he was trying to gauge if this was okay. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat when I felt his hand, warm and steady, resting on my thigh. The room seemed to shrink around us, and my heart pounded so hard I thought he might be able to hear it. There was a moment, just a heartbeat, where time seemed to stop. Neither of us moved, both caught in this suspended state where everything we'd been skating around that night was suddenly laid bare. I expected him to pull away, laugh it off, pretend it was nothing, but he didn't. Instead, his fingers curled slightly, a small movement that sent a shiver up my spine. I felt heat rush to my face, a mix of surprise and something deeper, more primal. Jake, I finally managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. I wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement, or maybe both. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in so close that his breath brushed against my cheek, smelling faintly of beer and something sweet. And then, before I could second guess it, his lips were on mine. It wasn't hesitant, it was confident, slow, like he'd been thinking about this for as long as I had. I froze for a second, the reality of what was happening short-circuiting my brain. But then instinct took over, and I kissed him back. It was soft at first, almost tentative, but it deepened quickly. The way his mouth moved against mine sent a spark straight through me, waking up every nerve ending. My hand found its way to the back of his neck, fingers tangling in his hair as he shifted, leaning more into me. The angle made it so uncomfortable, and I could feel the solid line of his body pressing into mine. The warmth of his hand on my leg hadn't moved, and it burned through the fabric of my jeans like a brand. I did the same when I reached it. I was excited that he was way bigger than mine. And when I say way bigger, I mean exactly it. Some part of me still expected him to pull back, for this to be some weird joke or a moment of drunken confusion. But instead, he pressed closer, deepening the kiss until it was all-consuming. I could feel his other hand slide up my side, fingers brushing my shirt up just enough that they met bare skin. The contact sent a shiver racing down my spine, and I gasped into his mouth. That tiny sound seemed to snap whatever tension was left, and suddenly we were moving in sync, mouths and hands finding new places to explore. Jake shifted again, this time pulling me down onto the bed with him so we were both lying on our sides. Faces just inches apart. His eyes searched mine, almost as if he was checking to make sure I was still okay with this. I didn't even hesitate. I leaned in, pressing my lips to his again. Harder this time. I felt his smile against my mouth. That slight curve before he kissed back more eagerly this time. His hand, still on my leg, inched higher, and I swallowed hard, nerves and anticipation tangling in my chest. I wanted him badly, but there was still this flicker of fear in the back of my mind. I didn't know if I was ready to cross that line. Didn't know what this would mean for us in the morning. But when his fingers brushed just a little higher, pressing against me through the fabric, those thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I made a sound I couldn't hold back, a mix between a sigh and a whimper, and that seemed to spur him on. He shifted so that he was half on top of me, the weight of him pressing me into the mattress, his hands slipping beneath the waistband of my jeans. I gasped again, eyes wide as I met his gaze. There was a question in his eyes, a silent ask, and all I could do was nod. The second I did, his lips were back on mine, more urgent this time, and his hand moved with a confidence that left me breathless. Everything felt heightened, his hand on my skin, the way his body pressed into mine, the rougher texture of his jeans against my legs. My own hands found their way under his shirt, fingers brushing the smooth, warm skin of his back, feeling the way his muscles tensed and shifted as he moved. It was overwhelming in the best way, every sensation crashing over me like a wave. I could barely think, just feel lost in the way we fit together. The noises from downstairs were a constant reminder that we weren't alone, that our parents were just a flight of stairs away, laughing and talking, glasses clinking. The contrast between the warmth and familiarity of the house and the raw electric charge in my room was dizzying. Jake paused for just a second, pulling back enough to catch his breath, and I could see the flush in his cheeks, the way his chest rose and fell rapidly. "We good, right?" he whispered, voice rough and low. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," I breathed out, barely recognizing my own voice. He smiled, a quick, lopsided grin made my chest ache in the best way. He kissed me again, slow this time, lips brushing mine, trailing down to my jaw, my neck. My body arched instinctively, a quiet plea for more. His hands slid further down, making me shiver, and I bit my lip to keep from making too much noise. I couldn't help it though. My breathing was coming in short, ragged gasps, and every touch felt magnified. Jake's touch was deliberate, slow, and careful in a way that sent waves of warmth coursing through me. The room was bathed in that golden, ambient glow, with only the faint sounds of laughter and conversation filtering in from downstairs. His eyes met mine, searching for any hint of hesitation. I could feel every breath he took, each one matching the rise and fall of my chest. The air between us was thick with a blend of nerves and excitement, and that tension made every inch of skin more sensitive than ever before. When his hand moved, it was almost reverent, exploring with a mixture of curiosity and confidence that made my pulse race. My body responded instinctively, stretching under his touch, a subtle shiver running down my spine. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was as if we had all the time in the world, and he was determined to make sure every moment was felt deeply and completely. The heat between us built gradually, like a fire catching slowly before bursting into full flame. My hands mirrored his movements, reaching out to touch him in the same way he was exploring me. The moment I did, there was this subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of surprise, a sharp intake of breath that told me he hadn't expected it. But he welcomed it. My fingers brushed over him, and it was impossible not to notice the difference. A jolt of surprise shot through me, eyes widening for a brief second as I realized just how much there was to take in. It wasn't a comparison that brought embarrassment or doubt. Instead, it was more of an acknowledgement of how new and vulnerable this all felt. The house was still alive downstairs. Laughter punctuating the air, the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of voices rising above the hum. It should have been enough to keep us grounded, a reminder that we weren't as alone as we felt. But in that moment, the sounds blurred into a dull backdrop, distant and insignificant compared to the whirlwind between Jake and me. His lips brushed along my jawline, finding their way down to the curve of my neck. The warmth of his breath tickled my skin, making it impossible not to let out a quiet sigh. Every touch was deliberate, unhurried, as if he wanted to map out every reaction, learn the way my body responded to him. I could feel the muscles in my stomach tighten, a tension building that was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. It was as if my body couldn't decide if it wanted to melt under the attention or brace for what was next. Jake's hands were steady as they moved, fingers trailing along my sides and pulling me closer. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where I caught his gaze. His eyes were dark, pupils blown wide, and there was this intensity there that made my breath catch. He leaned back just enough to meet my eyes fully. That silent question hovering between us again, unspoken but understood. Was this okay? Did we want this? I swallowed hard, heart thumping so loudly that it felt like it echoed in my ears. With a small nod, I closed the distance, pressing my lips back to his with a newfound urgency. The spark that had been simmering ignited, and suddenly we were moving together with more certainty. His hand found its way to the back of my neck, pulling me in deeper, while his other hand rested on my hip, grounding me in the moment. The noises from downstairs became more noticeable for a brief moment, a sudden burst of laughter that made my muscles tense. I could tell Jake heard it, too. He stilled for a second, listening, his breath coming out in short, hot bursts against my skin. The reality of the situation pressed down on us. We were in my room, barely a staircase away from our parents. And here we were crossing a line we hadn't dared approach until now. But the hesitation only lasted a moment. Jake leaned down, placing a slow, open-mouthed kiss on the side of my neck, and whispered, "I want you." The words sent a shiver racing down my spine, every nerve ending alight. I didn't trust my voice to respond, so I just nodded, letting my hands slide up his back, fingers slipping under the hem of his shirt to feel the warm skin there. The way his body moved under my touch, the subtle flex of muscle as he shifted, made my head spin. It wasn't just physical, though. It was the way he looked at me, the way his eyes softened when they met mine, the shared smiles between heated kisses, the quiet understanding that this was new for both of us, but something we both wanted. That connection made it more than just a physical act. It felt deeper, like we were both silently acknowledging the trust we'd built over the years and were now placing in each other's hands. The room felt warmer, the air thick with anticipation. Jake's hand moved lower, fingertips brushing the bare skin above the waistband of my jeans, and I felt my body arch instinctively, a silent plea for more. He paused just for a second, fingers hesitating as he glanced at me again. This time there was a hint of a smile on his lips, a mixture of nerves and excitement that mirrored what I was feeling. The moment stretched out just long enough for me to catch my breath and process everything that was happening. Then, without another word, he closed the space between us, pressing his lips to mine with a renewed fervor. I could feel the tension coiled in his body, the careful control he was holding on to. His movements were still gentle, but there was a raw edge to them now, a desperation that matched my own. I reached up, cupping his face with one hand as our kisses deepened, the heat between us building with every touch. Just when it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us, the sound of footsteps creaked on the floorboards downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, eyes wide as I listened intently. It was my mom, her voice floating up the stairs as she called out, "Everything okay up there? Do you guys need anything to eat or drink?" Panic shot through me, and I felt Jake tense against me, both of us holding our breath. The room was so silent that I was sure she could hear the pounding of my heart. For a moment, the reality of what we were doing crashed down on me, but then Jake's hand tightened on my hip, just slightly, and his eyes found mine, holding me in place. There was a challenge in his expression, a silent dare that sent a thrill through me. "Yeah, we're good," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, even though it came out slightly strained. "Just playing some video games." There was a pause, and I could picture her standing there, probably debating whether to come up or not. My pulse raced as I waited for her response. After a moment, her footsteps moved away, and I heard her laugh as she joined the conversation downstairs. The relief that flooded through me was instant, but it didn't erase the tension coursing through my body. Before I could say anything, Jake moved again, pressing a kiss to the corner of my mouth, then to my jaw, trailing down to my neck with a slow, deliberate pace. The warmth of his body pressed into mine, and I felt the anticipation coil tighter. His hand found its way under my shirt, fingers splayed against my skin as he whispered, "We're not stopping now." The room was a mix of shadows and the soft amber glow from outside, casting everything in a light that felt almost surreal. The sounds from downstairs faded back into the background, and it was just us again, caught in this moment that felt fragile and monumental all at once. I shifted under him, hands finding their way to his waist, pulling him closer as our mouths met in another heated kiss. The tension in the room was electric, each movement and touch a silent confirmation. Jake's breath was hot against my skin, each kiss leaving a trail of warmth that to sink deep into my bones. The way he looked at me, eyes half-lidded and filled with that mixture of affection and desire, made my heart squeeze in my chest. There was something about the vulnerability of the moment, the trust it took to let ourselves be this close, that made everything feel more intense. Outside, the night pressed in, the quiet hum of the neighborhood contrasting with the chaos inside my chest. We moved together, learning each other's rhythms, adjusting to the newness with soft laughter and stolen glances. It was clumsy at times, punctuated by whispered apologies and quiet chuckles. But it was ours, the kind of moment that even in its imperfection felt perfect in its own way. Every sound and touch felt amplified, the room becoming a world of its own where time seemed to slow. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and uneven, mixing with his as we paused, foreheads pressed together, catching our breath, the heat of his skin under my hands, the way his hair fell into his eyes. It was all so real, so overwhelming that it left me dizzy. When he whispered my name, voiced rough and low, I felt a shiver run through me. It wasn't just the physicality of the moment that left me breathless. It was the knowledge that this was Jake, the boy I'd grown up with, the one who knew all my secrets, who'd seen me at my best and worst. And now we were here, exploring a side of ourselves that had been unspoken until now. The night stretched on, filled with the soft sounds of the world outside and the quiet intimacy between us. Even as the noise from downstairs slowly faded and the house settled into silence, we didn't stop. We moved together, learning, adjusting, and savoring every touch and moment. It was more than just the physical connection. It was the unspoken understanding that this changed everything. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his body and the steady thrum of his heartbeat against mine, I didn't care about what tomorrow would bring. All that mattered was us. Here now, in the quiet of the night. Once the tension from the close call with my mom subsided, a different kind of energy settled over us. One that was both reassuring and electrifying at the same time. Jake's eyes met mine, and there was a quiet understanding there. A mutual acknowledgement that what was happening between us was bigger than either of us had anticipated. We weren't just two friends testing boundaries. We were stepping into something uncharted. Something that felt simultaneously delicate and powerful. He leaned in, brushing a kiss against my temple, lingering there for a moment as if to absorb the feeling of closeness. There was no rush in his movements, only the steady pulse of warmth radiating from where we touched. His fingers traced small, lazy patterns along my side, grounding me and sending sparks across my skin. It was comforting in a way to feel his heartbeat match mine. Both of us caught in the thrill of the unknown and the safety of knowing it was us. Here together, our breathing was the only sound in the room now, a shared cadence that felt almost musical. Jake's hand rested on my waist, the heat of his touch seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt. He pressed his forehead against mine, our noses almost touching, and a small, lopsided smile played on his lips. "You okay?" he whispered, barely loud enough to hear, but the sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. "Yeah," I replied, my voice softer than I'd expected. "Better than okay." He exhaled a laugh, a sound so genuine it made my heart stutter. The look in his eyes shifted then, from playful to something deeper, more serious. He brought one hand up to cup the side of my face, his thumb brushing lightly over my cheekbone. The moment was filled with so much anticipation that I almost forgot to breathe. Then, slowly, he leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that was tender and searching, like he was committing this moment to memory. There was a quiet vulnerability in the way we moved together, a kind of silent conversation that spoke of trust and newfound discovery. His kisses grew bolder, pressing deeper, and I felt the tension coil tighter in my stomach. Every touch, every shared breath felt heightened, as though we were seeing each other through an entirely new lens. The Jake I knew, the one who made stupid jokes and played video games until late, was still here, but so was someone else. Someone who looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. When he shifted, positioning himself slightly above me, his hands were careful and steady, holding me like he was afraid I might slip away. The weight of him was comforting, grounding me in the reality of what we were doing. His eyes scanned my face for any sign of doubt, and I offered a small nod, reassuring him without words that I wanted this just as much as he did. As he leaned down, his mouth found a sensitive spot just below my ear, and I felt a shiver run through me. The sensation was intense, almost overwhelming, and I found myself holding on to his shoulders tighter, my body instinctively arching closer. The gentleness in his touch was unwavering, the careful way he held me as though I was something to be cherished. Outside, the world continued on, cars passing by, the muffled sounds of our parents downstairs. But here, in this moment, it felt like everything had paused. There was just the quiet hum of our shared breathing, the soft creak of the bed as we adjusted, and the whispered words that occasionally passed between us. Little affirmations that neither of us would have thought to say out loud in any other context. "You're amazing," he murmured at one point, his voice thick with sincerity, and it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. The initial nervousness ebbed away as we fell into a rhythm, each touch and movement becoming more familiar, more confident. It was still new, still tinged with the awkwardness of firsts, but it was also filled with laughter. Small, breathless chuckles that came when we bumped noses or shifted awkwardly. Those moments were what made it real, what reminded me that this was us. The same two friends who had spent countless nights talking about everything and nothing. At one point, I reached up to push the hair from his eyes, my fingers lingering in the soft strands. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring it. The vulnerability of it all was almost too much, a feeling that pressed against my chest with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. But when he looked at me again, eyes open and full of so much unspoken emotion, the fear melted away, replaced by something deeper, trust, maybe, or the realization that this was a turning point for both of us. The night wrapped around us like a blanket, the air heavy with the scent of us and the warmth of our closeness. The house settled into a quieter state as the evening stretched on, and the noises from downstairs faded, leaving only the occasional creak of the floorboards and the murmur of voices as background noise. We moved in tandem, slow and deliberate, each shift a reminder of the trust between us and the significance of this shared moment. Jake's touch never lost its tenderness. Even as things became more intense, he held me like he was afraid to break the spell, like he understood the weight of what we were sharing. The gentleness of it all made the occasional sharp gasp or sigh feel more intimate, more special, as if we were sharing secrets only the night could keep. As the moments bled into each other, we found ourselves lying side by side, facing each other with our legs tangled. The room was dimly lit, the glow from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across his face. He looked peaceful, eyes half closed as he traced random patterns on my arm. We didn't need to say much. Everything that mattered had already been communicated in the quiet exchanges. The touches, and the looks. Was this weird? He asked suddenly, breaking the silence with a question that made me chuckle. Weird? Yeah, maybe a little, I admitted, grinning as I nudged him with my elbow. But a good kind of weird. He smiled, a lazy, satisfied grin that made my heart flutter. Yeah, the best kind. I'll never forget that morning. It started off like any other. Or so I thought. It was early, sunlight barely cutting through the curtains. And my phone buzzed with a message from Jake. My heart always skipped a beat when I saw his name. But this one hit different. Hey, are you free this morning? My parents left for the day. You can come over if you want. Reading it, my stomach did this little flip. We'd been hanging out, meeting up in random places, sharing stolen moments that always seemed too brief. It wasn't that I didn't want to bring him over. I would have loved to. But the complications were obvious. The secrecy of it all. Having to be careful with every touch. Every glance that lingered too long in public. It was equal parts thrilling and frustrating. But here he was, inviting me to his place. Just the two of us. With the whole morning stretched out ahead, I got ready as quickly as I could, trying to temper the nervous energy bubbling up in me. When I finally reached his house and knocked, he answered almost immediately, like he'd been waiting right by the door. We just stood there for a second, both grinning like idiots, a shared understanding passing between us. He let me inside, and it felt surreal, like stepping into a space that was so distinctly his, yet completely unknown to me. We wandered into the living room, each of us unsure how to start, and at the same time, maybe we both knew where this was leading. He looked at me with that soft, slightly lopsided smile, the one that always made me feel like he could see right through me. Our hands brushed, and in that small touch, there was this electric charge that I couldn't ignore. I felt like every step brought us closer to a place we hadn't yet been, but that we both thought about countless times. Jake led me to his room, a space filled with traces of him, posters on the walls, a couple of books tossed on his desk, and that faint scent that was unmistakably his. Something earthy, warm, and familiar. We stood there for a moment, the quiet between us thick with anticipation. He reached out, hesitating, his hand hovering just by my shoulder. And then, as if deciding there was no turning back, he closed the distance, his hand resting gently on my arm. I remember feeling so aware of everything in that moment. The way his fingers felt, the warmth radiating from him, even the slight hitch in my own breath. Our eyes met, and then, without needing to say a word, he leaned in. His lips were soft, tentative at first, as if testing the waters. But then the kiss deepened, and it was like the floodgates had opened. All the stolen glances, the restrained touches, it all poured out in that one kiss. We fell into a rhythm that felt so natural, like we'd been waiting for this moment longer than we realized. Our hands began to explore, tracing the lines of each other's faces, arms, and backs, learning the shapes and contours that had until then been only a distant fantasy. There was something so vulnerable in it, like we were bearing more than just skin, revealing pieces of ourselves that had been kept guarded and hidden. I could feel his heart pounding against my chest as I ran my fingers down his back, feeling the muscles tense and relax under my touch. His hands were in my hair, his fingers weaving through, and every now and then he pulled back just enough to look at me. His eyes full of something intense, almost overwhelming. Each kiss felt like a new discovery, every touch an affirmation that, yes, this was real. We were here together. As we moved closer, exploring the length of our bodies, I felt this intense blend of excitement and tenderness. Our breaths mingled, each sigh, each quiet whisper adding to the atmosphere that enveloped us. It was as if time slowed, every moment stretching out, making every touch, every kiss feel infinite. His hands traced patterns across my skin, warm and deliberate, making me shiver under his touch. There was something so grounding yet intoxicating about the way he held me. His hands firm, but his touch gentle, almost reverent. We lost ourselves in that space, each movement a silent conversation. I loved the way his skin felt beneath my fingertips, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the quiet noises he'd make whenever my lips found a sensitive spot along his neck. His collarbone. We shared laughter between whispers, a soft chuckle when one of us brushed against something too ticklish, only to dive back into that gentle, consuming rhythm. It was as much about discovery as it was about the quiet assurance we found in each other's embrace. In a world that often felt so confusing and overwhelming, those moments with Jake were like an anchor, something solid and grounding. We took our time, letting every touch, every kiss, every brush of skin against skin tell the story we'd both been holding inside. There was a raw honesty in the way we moved together, a kind of wordless confession that only we could understand, laying together in the quiet, with his arm wrapped around me and my head resting on his chest. I could feel his heartbeat gradually slowing down, matching the steady rhythm of my own. We hadn't said much afterward. Words felt unnecessary, like anything we could say would only fall short of the quiet, intense connection lingering between us. Just being there, tangled up with him in the soft afternoon light, felt like something out of a dream. We were in that perfect, comfortable silence when a faint noise reached us. The unmistakable crunch of car tires on gravel. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but as it got closer, Jake's eyes flew open for a split second. We looked at each other, each of us processing what we just heard. Then came another sound, one that made my heart drop. Voices. And not just any voices. Jake's father. They were home. We both jolted upright, our peaceful moment instantly replaced with pure, unfiltered panic. "Oh, God," he muttered on with a kind of frantic speed that only sheer panic can summon. It was a mess, a blur of fumbling and hurried whispers, neither of us wanting to imagine what would happen if his parents walked in on us like this. As soon as we were semi-presentable, he tossed me a game controller, his eyes wide with a silent plea to go along with it. We sat on the edge of his bed, controllers in hand, trying desperately to look like we'd been casually hanging out, maybe even joking around, instead of what we'd actually been doing just moments before. His dad's voice was clearer now, moving down the hallway. For a few tense seconds, we could hear them moving around outside, talking in low voices, their footsteps coming closer and closer. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding so loud that I was sure Jake could hear it. But then, as if by some miracle, his parents paused just outside his door, exchanging a few words before heading to the kitchen instead. "Close one," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with relief. And I let out a shaky laugh, unable to believe we'd managed to pull that off. We played along for a few minutes, pressing buttons and pretending to focus on the screen, even though neither of us could have said what game we were playing. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a sitcom, and we both knew it was only a matter of time before his parents would start asking questions. Sure enough, after a few minutes, Jake's mom called out, her voice warm and inviting. "You're welcome to stay for dinner if you'd like." I managed a polite smile, although I was still half panicked and probably looked as awkward as I felt. "Oh, thank you, but I should really get going," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. The last thing I wanted was to push our luck any further. After a few quick goodbyes and one last glance at Jake, I left, stepping back out into the open air with my nerves still buzzing. The walk home was strange. Part of me was still in a mild state of shock, but another part of me couldn't help but laugh at how close we'd come to being caught. And then, as if the universe wanted to add one last twist to the story, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jake. I opened it, expecting something sweet, maybe even a relieved joke about our narrow escape. But his message was far more amusing and a lot more embarrassing. "You forgot your panties. You idiot." My face instantly went hot. I'd been so busy scrambling to get dressed that I hadn't even realized. All I could do was laugh. Half in disbelief, half out of sheer relief. Thank God, I thought to myself. Thank God he found them and not his parents. The whole situation felt like one of those moments you'd look back on and laugh about later. But right then all I could think was that I needed to go back to collect myself and my stray belongings before the next time we found ourselves alone. Because with Jake, I had a feeling there would definitely be a next time. The holidays had come, and for most people, that meant time with family, relaxing days at home, or road trips to see relatives. But for us, it meant a stretch of time that we wouldn't be able to see each other. Jake's parents had taken time off, so he was pretty much under their watchful eye the whole break. And it was driving me insane. We tried to stay in touch, sneaking messages whenever we could, but it wasn't the same as being together. I missed his laugh, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. As the days dragged on, the longing only grew. One evening, bored out of my mind and frustrated with how long it had been since we'd seen each other, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted him, impulsive and a bit reckless. "Let's go out, just for a coffee or something. I can't sit here thinking about you any longer without actually seeing you." It didn't take long for him to agree. He must have been feeling it, too, because he replied immediately with a "yes. Just tell me where and when." I felt a thrill in my chest just reading that. We agreed to meet at a little cafe on the edge of town. One that was usually quiet and wouldn't attract too much attention. When we finally saw each other, it was like all the pent-up energy, all the nights lying awake thinking about him, came rushing back. The conversation started out easy enough, laughing over our coffee, talking about whatever had happened over the break. But I could feel the tension between us, this undercurrent that kept pulling us closer with each passing minute. My heart was pounding, and every time our eyes met, I felt that magnetic pull, this unspoken invitation to move closer. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned forward, my hand reaching for his, and I whispered, almost daring myself to say it, "Let's go somewhere else." He raised an eyebrow, catching on immediately, his eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and excitement. Without another word, we left the cafe, both of us driven by something more intense than just wanting to spend time together. I led the way, taking his hand as we made our way down the street, the tension between us buzzing like an electric current. We found a motel just outside town, a little place that looked like it had seen its fair share of couples seeking a few private hours together. I paid at the counter, and we quickly headed up to the room, not even waiting for the elevator as we took the stairs two at a time. The moment we stepped inside, the door barely closed behind us. We were on each other, the distance we'd had to endure over the past days melting away as our hands roamed and our lips met in a series of deep, urgent kisses. This time I was determined to be the one in control. I'd thought about him so much, imagined so many scenarios, and now that he was finally here, I couldn't wait any longer. I pushed him back onto the bed, a playful grin on my face as I straddled him, pinning him beneath me. He looked up at me, his breath coming in short gasps, and I could see that he was as ready as I was to give in to this. There was a thrill in taking charge, seeing the way he responded to me, the way his body relaxed under mine, surrendering to whatever I wanted. My hands moved over him slowly, exploring him, taking my time as I felt the warmth of his skin through his clothes. He let out a soft sigh, his hands resting lightly on my waist, letting me lead. Each kiss, each touch felt like a revelation, as if we were peeling back layers we hadn't even known were there. I kissed him deeply, my hands threading through his hair, feeling him melt under me as his body responded to my every move. I could sense his anticipation, the way his hands clenched and unclenched against my back, almost as if he were holding himself back, letting me take him wherever I wanted. The air around us was thick with a kind of intimacy that went beyond words. Something unspoken yet so intense that it left us both breathless. As I kissed along his neck, he tilted his head back, letting out a quiet moan that made me feel powerful, like I had this incredible effect on him that only I could create. It was more than just physical. It felt like I was seeing a side of him he didn't show to anyone else. A vulnerability that he trusted me with completely. And in that moment, I wanted nothing more than to make him feel as good as he made me feel. To show him that he could let go. That he didn't have to hold anything back. I leaned back, looking down at him, taking in the way his eyes were heavy-lidded. His cheeks flushed. He looked up at me with a mix of awe and desire. And it sent a rush of warmth through me. I moved slowly, savoring every second, every touch, feeling his body respond beneath me. It was like a dance. One where we moved together perfectly, each of us attuned to the other, completely in sync. In general, this is the story of my love for my cousin. Yes, strange, but what can you do? Love is a strong thing. If anyone is interested, we are still dating in secret from everyone. I don't know where this will lead, but I like it.